Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, welcome to another episode of the Lunch Hour Podcast with Federal Newswire. I am your host, Andrew Langer. Joining me today is a very old friend of mine, someone I've worked with on and off for more than 20 years, as I was just explaining to somebody. His name is Jerry Rogers. He is now the editor of Real Clear Policy. He's been an editor of other Real Clear pages for a number of years. He's also a radio talk show host on WBAL News Radio 1090 out of Baltimore. And Jerry, let's start here. I know this is not the policy side of things. We are recording this just after the midterm elections happened. Let's talk about, you've already done some deep dives into how voters voted the way they did. There were some surprises, obviously. That's an understatement, Jerry, that there were some surprises in this election. But you have gotten an early grasp as to really what the electorate was thinking about. Talk to us about that.
Well, sure. And again, the reason for the deeper dive is because I'm watching the various news shows and the cable shows, and there's a lot of just superficial, it was this or it was that, and it's more complicated. The American people are more complicated than that. Look, inflation was the number one issue, but abortion was also a top tier issue, especially for Democrats. It was number 4, number 5. But it turns out that if you were a likely Democrat voter, 76% went to the Democrat candidate. But the analysis is, well, abortion played a big part. Well, yes and no. It played a big part because the Republicans never offered up an alternative. There has been this false narrative that abortion bans nationally, that if you have a miscarriage, you wouldn't get help at an emergency room. And the Republicans made a decision to leave abortion alone. And that turns out to be a mistake. The governors that signed into law restrictions on abortion, who were able to offer up some common sense and some consensus positions on abortion, all won re-election in big numbers. So again, it was a miscalculation not to articulate a vision on women's health, on abortion issues, because what happened was the Democrats' false narrative took hold. And that was a big issue.
In other words, policy actually does matter, doesn't it? And so, you are now the editor of Real Clear Policy. Let's start there. Talk a little bit about the Real Clear family of websites, Real Clear Politics, but talk about the role that Real Clear Policy plays in all of this.
Well, sure. I mean, Real Clear Policy really is the ideas factory. It's almost a think tank in its function. And what we try to do is take the best ideas from Brookings and from the Center for American Progress from the left, but also couple them with the best ideas coming from the Heritage Foundation and Americans for Tax Reform. And also, it's a place to go to see the best opinion, commentary, ideas coming out of the Wall Street Journal and New York Times, and a host of other venues. It really is Real Clear Policy, Real Clear Politics broadly. It's the last place where both the left and the right have a shared real estate. Both are coming to read about ideas. And I think that's important, and I think you make a good point. This election, voters really considered policy and policy choices. The problem, the challenge moving forward, is that one party in particular, the GOP, needs to do a better job articulating its positions.
But this is one of the things, you and I have talked about this quite a bit in the past, right? There is the adage that if you're explaining, you're losing. But what you're talking about is the need to explain. These are complicated issues. When we talk about, let's say, climate change is the left is Earth's getting hotter, so we need to get rid of fossil fuels. It is much, much more complicated than that. How is it that we can have these conversations about these complex issues? Heck, you and I will get into healthcare in a second, but let's start with sort of the general aspect of it.
Well, again, I think the problem isn't so much making the complex conversational. We can do that. The left does it. They turned climate change into it's for the children. They turned public education policy into it's for the children. I mean, they're able to make complex issues very conversational. The challenge is we have to do that. And it obviously can be done. I tell you who did it. Ron DeSantis did it. Yeah. Governor DeWine in Ohio did it. Governor Sununu in New Hampshire did it. Governor Abbott in Texas did it. To say that our ideas are too complicated and therefore we can't express them, I think is a cop-out. Here's the real issue.
Yeah.
The real issue is that Democrats put their money where their mind is. They have the conviction of their ideas. They really do believe that democracy is in jeopardy. They really do believe that abortion should be up till birth. They really do believe these things. And Republicans are afraid to express themselves. But they shouldn't be, because where we see Republicans expressing hard conservative truths, they win. Ron DeSantis, again, I encourage your listeners and your viewers, go and watch his election night speech. It'll give you goosebumps. And he takes on all the hard issues, and he takes on all of the boogeymen that the left puts up.
You know, it's interesting because you and I have spent a lot of time talking about places like Maryland, right? And you have Governor Larry Hogan, now outgoing governor. They've got a new governor coming in, Wes Moore. Larry Hogan spent 8 years, was able to get reelected, and one can say that, was it really about a Larry Hogan agenda, or was it really about the bad Democratic candidates that he ran against? But the issue comes into play, which is, you know, from a substantive perspective, what did Larry Hogan really do or accomplish in Maryland from a policy perspective?
Well, first, let's dispel this myth that the Democrat candidates were bad candidates. He ran against Anthony Brown his first time around. And Anthony Brown went on to win a seat in Congress. He's now the incoming Attorney General of the state of Maryland. He's a serious player. And so there was some competition there. And what Larry Hogan was able to do early was articulate this idea: you're taxed enough, you're regulated enough, our cities are dangerous, crime is a problem. But again, similar to President Trump, a lot of talk, a lot of bluster, a lot of me, I. But at the end of the day, you're correct. At the end of the day, Maryland is ranked 46 out of 50 in terms of the economy and taxes. He leaves office with no lasting policy legacy, nothing, literally zero. He leaves with a high approval rating, and that seems to be his one accomplishment.
Right. It was sort of maintaining the status quo, and that was a situation. But and in contrast,
but there was,
of course,
I do think there was promise with him. He could have been the America's governor,
right.
But again, but he chose to be safe. He chose to be someone who wanted to be the darling of the media. He became, to a lesser extent, without the military background, he became John McCain. He became the Republican on The View, on Comedy Central, the Sunday talk shows. Because
the battles he did choose, he picked were battles of personality against Donald Trump,
yes.
which translated into bad policy. Again, to come back to this, it translated, whether it was the stuff he did on COVID with the testing kits, or whether it was his refusal to send National Guard troops from Maryland down to the border. There are a whole host of things that are out there. Very strange battles that he decided to wage his political capital. Talk about that.
No, and again, his defenders will say, look, he had a super majority of Democrats in both the House of Delegates and the state Senate. And I would push back in two areas. Number one, well, the reason why they gained a supermajority was because Larry Hogan never built a network of conservatives and a coalition of GOP allies. But more importantly, what Larry Hogan never did was what previous governors did when they had a recalcitrant legislature. he never used the budget. He never used the purse strings. He could have refused. You're going to vote this way. You're not going to give me this bill. We're not going to have tax reform. Well, then I'm going to hold the money for this project.
Sure.
We're going to hold back the money on that project. But you see, he never had the courage of his convictions. And again, that's the theme, I think. The theme for Republicans this election cycle is if you want to win, you have to believe in something and offer something. Again, the cliche, Andrew, you can't beat something with nothing.
Sure.
And I would say in many of the instances why we didn't see a red wave was because there were too many Republicans who were just offering up Democrats are bad. And that's true, maybe, but you have to say, well, why are you good?
And so let's get into one of the areas. I want to talk about crime for a moment. Dan Roderick's Crime in Cities. Dan Roderick, who's a columnist of note for the Baltimore Sun, accused Republicans of not having any ideas when it comes to cities. You clearly disagree with this. Toot your horn. You worked for a number of years with an outfit called the Manhattan Institute. Talk about that. Yeah.
Well, again, if you're not familiar with the Manhattan Institute, just go to their website. This is an urban policy city think tank that, quite frankly, in the 80s came up with the blueprint that produced urban renaissance from Los Angeles to New York and from Houston to Detroit. I mean, this is still an ideas factory. There are lots of good ideas coming from the right center for cities on education, on crime, on criminal justice, on all these issues. The problem is that the left no longer believes in diversity. And what I mean by that is that you look at Los Angeles, you look at Chicago, Philadelphia, Baltimore City. It's one party rule, and no one brings in anything of contrary. No diversity of ideas, no competition for ideas. And so when Dan Roderick says that there are no ideas from the right on urban policy, he's just betraying that he lives in a bubble.
Yeah, no, I think that's very true. So before you became the editor of Real Clear Policy, you were the editor of a number of other Real Clear websites as well, Real Clear Books and Culture, but most importantly, I think
Real Clear Health.
But most importantly, Real Clear Health. Thank you, Jerry. Yes, Jerry and I have a lot of shorthand together. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But to tie in what you've been saying about ideas and explaining ideas, one of the great failures in the pushback against the Affordable Care Act was the inability of Republicans to articulate, right? When you're talking about repeal and replace, you have to replace it with something. Republicans couldn't agree on what to replace it with, I submit, because they had a fundamental disagreement on the problems with healthcare. What do you think on this?
Well, again, and I'll give you my 2 cents. The problem wasn't so much that there weren't ideas. I mean, now, if you go to Real Clear Health, Grace Marie Turner lays out an agenda for the new Congress on healthcare ideas. The ideas are there. I know that Republicans have put forward this thing called the Healthy Futures Act,
yes,
which is a composite. It's a collection of all kinds of ideas to reform healthcare. The problem with Obamacare was that the Republicans, were too tied to the industries. They were tied to the insurance industry. They were tied to big pharma, and they capitulated.
Yeah.
And to a certain extent, I know no Republican voted for it, but behind the scenes, who do you think wrote Obamacare? It was Big Pharma.
Yes.
And Big Pharma employs a lot of Republican lobbyists. And Billy Tozen at the time, who was the head of Pharma, he's a former congressman, both a Democrat and Republican. He served as both a D and an R from Louisiana. Good man. Billy Tozen's a good man.
Yeah.
But he said on one of the cable news programs at the time, he said, we'll sacrifice price controls for volume.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so what happened was it really was the powers, the establishment, right? The Washington class decided that, yeah, we'll accept less freedom, more regulations, if it means more money in our pocket. And that's been the problem with healthcare. There needs to be a divorce between the idea factories, the Republican Party, and the industry sector. I mean, big pharma and big insurance do lots of big things wrong.
See, this is where I was going to go, which is the whole side of big insurance, and focusing on it as an insurance problem was always the wrong way to look at it. I mean, we're seeing this issue with the issue of pharma and prescription drugs in the Inflation Reduction Act. There's a huge problem. What's going to happen explain what went on in the Inflation Reduction Act and what we're looking at down the road.
Well, again, false narratives, misinformation. So the Democrats and the Biden administration said that the Inflation Reduction Act will bring drug prices, make them lower for all Americans, because Medicare helps set the prices for drug prices in the overall market. And what the Inflation Reduction Act does, so say the Democrats, is allow for Medicare to negotiate with the drug companies for lower prices. The problem is that that's completely untrue. It is an untruth. The fact is that what the Inflation Reduction Act does, it gives the Secretary of Health and Human Services the power without any veto. No one can say you can't do this. Congress has no oversight. The HHS Secretary can choose medicines in Medicare and say, nope, that's too much, and he can set a price.
It's crazy.
And the drug companies have to accept it, or they can't sell the drug. And so what that will do, it has already happened. The evidence is piling in. Drug companies have already decided not to do certain research. So we're going to have less innovation, and ultimately, when you have price controls, prices go up ultimately. And the CBO, the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, when they scored this bill, said that the only way you'll ever save money in Medicare is to deny access to care to seniors. Sure. So ultimately, what the Inflation Reduction Act does, beside all the green energy nonsense, what it does is it lays the groundwork for denying access to needed health care to our seniors and ultimately to the rest of us.
Yeah, and at the same time stifling innovation, driving up prices.
Sure.
So it's a win-win for everybody, Jerry, isn't it?
It should have been called the Green New Deal and, oh, by the way, No New Cures Act.
But I want to dive a little bit into this. What did you call it? The health plan that the upcoming health plan that colleagues
the
of yours. Healthy Futures Initiatives.
Act.
What is in the Healthy Futures Act?
Digital health, proposals, telehealth proposals. Do you know that one positive that came out of the pandemic was the rise of telehealth?
Yeah.
However, in Medicare and in other insurance programs, telehealth is a second or third thought.
Yeah.
Well, this would provide incentives. This would provide opportunities for telehealth in Medicare and in government healthcare systems, but also allow for more innovation. Again, I don't want to get into pro-market, anti-market, because sometimes people get hooked on words. The fact is that if we want to see healthcare, what we have to see, and we see it in the Healthy Futures Act, we need to see less government interference. We need to see more innovation. Let companies invest their money. We should stop price setting. We price set everywhere. Think about the Medicare system, Medicaid system. Think about TRICARE and the veteran system. All kinds of price setting. We should do one good thing the Trump administration did is allow for more private choice and allow for more private hospitals and private healthcare in the VA. And so there's in the Healthy Futures initiatives, there's more of that. There's more choice. And again, I think it's important that we have to allow for doctors and scientists, and we have to allow for medicine to run medicine. The pandemic completely politicized medicine to a point that we haven't seen before. And the Healthy Futures Act gets back to letting doctors and scientists run medicine, not politicians.
But talk about the perversion of the word science. Follow the science is what we're constantly being told. But go ahead.
Well, we should follow the science, and obviously after the pandemic, not the scientists.
Yes.
And what I mean by that, I'm being cute, right? But what I mean by that is that Dr. Fauci, Dr. Birx, God bless them. I don't have any animus toward either one. Dr. Francis from the NIH and others, what they did was they started to run the public health entities.
Yeah.
The NIH, the CDC, the HHS, started to run them like political entities. You know, and look, I know that you've talked about this before. There's always been trouble with public health getting into the business of politics.
Yeah.
On the gun issue, on other issues, right? But during the pandemic, it was put into hyperdrive, and they politicized a virus, and a lot of it had to do with they didn't like who the current president, who he was, how he was handling things. And so they started to leverage the public health communities. There needs to be a reckoning. I've said this before. Right now, if you polled, the American people do not trust public health, the public health community.
Sure.
That's bad news for healthcare, for innovation. It's bad news for science. There has to be a reckoning. You know, The Atlantic, right?
Yes.
Put out a piece recently. There needs to be a COVID amnesty. In other words, forget what happened. We can't forget what happened because we closed the schools down knowing in retrospect and enduring that the children were never a vector. We closed down small businesses and restaurants knowing they weren't a vector of the spread. We can't go back to that. There has to be a reckoning.
And I'm going to take another step, Jerry, and say that in an environment in which people were held to ridicule if they didn't go with the crowd, if they didn't follow everybody else, if they dared question anything, they were called, we've had this conversation about election denialists, COVID denialists who are out there. That, when people were literally being drummed out of public life, remember, right? But we had the scientist who was put on Maryland's COVID response team by Larry Hogan, who had dared suggest that the Wuhan lab leak theory was a possibility.
Dr. Robert Redfield,
Yeah.
Who is a nonpartisan, overall good guy scientist.
Right.
And he had the gall to speak out the idea that, well, perhaps this came from the Wuhan lab, and he was drummed out as a racist.
Right.
And it turns out now, after a Senate report and other investigations, it is likely, essentially we all know now that it did come from the lab in Wuhan.
Well, and it gets into, right, because you and I have seen this also in terms of the climate side of things. We've talked about climate change science, a Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, physicists, including the head of that entity, being drummed out because they dared sort of voice skepticism over the global approach to climate change. We've seen this elsewhere. This gets into what you're saying about follow the science, not the scientists, because all of a sudden it becomes a massive cult of personality.
I also think that we have to, when we hear the term denialist, or he or she is a denier, that should put our guard up.
Yeah.
Because, and this is why I'm disappointed in the election results. Not because my side didn't do as well as I had hoped, because I was hoping to move past this cancel culture, if you don't like what I'm saying, then, if you say what I don't like, you're out of here. There really has been a stifling of the public discourse, the exchange of ideas. If we're going to fix things, right? One of my criticisms of the GOP was they didn't put forward a program to deal with inflation, to deal with high energy costs. They said a lot about the other guys, the Dems were bad, but they should have been more proactive in terms of why we're good. But again, how do you have a debate over inflation or tax policy or energy cost or climate change and drilling or not drilling and all this if you're going to simply dismiss out of hand one side of the argument?
Right. Well,
that's a problem.
That's certainly the issue. And part of what we're getting at with this podcast is trying to humanize people. You know, and let's pull it back a little bit, Jerry. You know, you've been involved in these issues for almost a quarter century, maybe even a full quarter century. You don't look old enough.
Old.
Yes, that's my way of calling you old. But what I don't think I've ever even asked you this. Maybe I have. Maybe we've had these conversations. What got you interested? I mean, you graduated from college. You taught at the high school level for a couple of years.
Sure.
But what got you involved on the policy and political side of things?
Well, I tell you the truth. Up until
last week, Andrew.
Up until I was, I wanted to be a priest when I was a kid.
Okay.
When I was 8 years old and I made my first Holy Communion, I was going to be a priest. I liked the idea of living in community and being an evangelist, being a missionary, right?
Yeah.
And then I'm driving with my father. Again, I'm 8 or 9 years old on the Cross Bronx Expressway. And there is street after street after street in the Bronx burnt out.
Yeah.
And it looked like these could be nice neighborhoods, parks. Even as a kid, I'm thinking, well, there's a park right there. Well, why are all those buildings abandoned? And I said to my father, he's driving his Dodge Dart Swinger. And I say, Pop, what's going on here? And my father's response was, the damn liberals, Jerry.
Yeah.
And that was the day I decided, well, I can't have this. This is my city. And so that's when I, at 8 years old, 9 years old, I went from wanting to be the priest to wanting to be the president because I was, again, as a kid. But politics, it was from living in New York and seeing the decay of the city I loved, and my father's kind of his visceral understanding of it. That's what got me into the idea of engaging in politics.
Again, another question I've never asked you. Did you ever have the situation, the experience driving with your parents and you see a park in the city and you want to go play in the park and your parents are like, no, we can't go there. You had that experience too?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I mean, look, even when I was older and you were older, Bryant Park in Manhattan across from the New York City Library, it's a beautiful park. But when we were young men, it was a den of heroin users and drug pushers and all the rest of it. And again, I knew the day New York was healed of its urban decay was when, again, as an younger man in my in the mid 90s, I went into the city. And I went and I had lunch in Bryant Park.
Wow. Yes.
And it was the first time in my life that I was able to sit there. And again, here's the thing about politics. It is personal in a sense that bad decisions impact your family in a bad way. I talked to a very close family member of mine who voted for Barack Obama the second time. And I said, Barack Obama caused my health insurance to go from $700 a month to $3,600 a month.
Yeah.
And I said, so his policies on Obamacare hurt my family. Yeah. And the same is true today, right? There's a reason why prices are higher, energy costs are higher, gas prices are higher. It's not because of some market glitch or some problem with supply chain, although those things might factor into it. It's because of decisions being made by the Biden administration. Their decisions are having a trickle-down negative impact on my family.
So normally, Jerry, when we have these conversations, I talk about outside interests and hobbies and things. I know full well you don't have any hobbies because you don't have any time for it.
I coach. I coach.
Well, that's true. You do coach, but I actually wanted to turn to this other entity, radio and talk radio. And you've been on WBAL for 5 years now, right?
Going on 5 years. That's
5 years.
Yeah. My show, we're in our fourth year, but I was a fill-in host for about a year before that. So
yeah, I need to have a conversation with the guy who brought you on to start filling in because he and I need to have a conversation.
I think you were the guy.
Yes,
ultimately,
I was
the guy who brought me in.
It would be a very one-sided conversation. But you've always.
By the way, for your listeners, I wouldn't be involved in radio at all if it wasn't for you, Andrew.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. But time out for a second. But I brought you in obviously because you're a friend of mine and we've done other things before. But you've had a love of talk radio as a medium for a long time. So talk a little bit about that as a medium and your approach to doing your radio show on Sundays and sometimes on Wednesdays.
Sure. Well, again, the reason why I love radio was because when I was a kid, right, there was ABC, NBC, PBS, CBS. There was the New York Times, Washington Post. There was the Evening News. All your information came from essentially, in my mind, what was a single source. However, I could get my radio, or my Walkman, and I could go to WABC New York, and I could hear Bob Grant, or I could hear back
Get
in
off
the
my
late 80s.
phones. Yes.
Yeah, I could hear back in the late 80s for the first time a guy named Rush Limbaugh.
Yeah.
And it was exciting because they were saying things that I knew were correct. Here's, again, you asked about how I got involved in politics. I knew I believed certain things, but I wasn't well read. I came from a family. My dad was a transit worker, 8th grade education. My mom sold Avon and was a babysitter. God bless her. They're smart, awesome people, but they weren't. We weren't reading great books when I was a kid. And then when I got older, I was, my parents worked hard to put me through Catholic school, and I started to realize, there's Russell Kirk. And I started to get excited about ideas, but it wasn't really until my freshman year at Fordham University where I had just discovered Rush Limbaugh, right? So I discovered Rush. It was 1989, 1988.
You discovered Rush Limbaugh, not the band Rush, which I discovered in 1982.
No, yeah. In fact, what I was doing, Andrew, was I was working. I'm an Irish guy. I was doing a painting and construction job, and I, to entertain myself, I put my headphones on my Walkman, and I found WABC because I was listening. I wanted to hear the Yankee game.
Sure.
And the Yankee, and instead they had this guy Rush Limbaugh, and I fell in love with talk radio. But more than that, at the same time, I discovered two other things. I discovered National Review magazine. I was at a newsstand in Manhattan, and I found this magazine. I was like, wow, there are people who agree with me. And for the first time, I went to CPAC.
Yes.
And so talk radio, CPAC, and National Review magazine were really what sustained me, so I could catch up and read all the books that I know that you had already read by that time.
Greatest Yankee ever, Jerry Rogers?
This is Mickey Mantle.
Mickey Mantle. There you go.
Number 7.
Number 7 on the field. Number 1 in your hearts. Jerry Rogers.
I never saw Mickey Mantle play, but my father said at one point when Mickey Mantle passed away, my father was heartbroken, and he said that baseball should have stopped when Mickey Mantle died.
Well,
go ahead.
For me, it was the day Thurman Munson died in 1979.
I love Thurman Munson. I love Mickey Rivers. I love Derek Jeter. I love Paul O'Neill. Yeah. I mean, Chris Chambliss. The list is endless. But Mickey Mantle is not only the greatest Yankee of all time. I would argue he's the greatest ball player of all time.
One of the best experiences I've ever had in my years in D.C. was going to a Yankee game with Jerry Rogers. Happened to be at Camden Yards, because who can afford to go to the Yankee Stadium?
How many hamburgers did I eat?
I don't remember. I have no idea. Jerry Rogers, how do people find the Real Clear family of websites?
Well, just go to www.realclearpolitics.com, and then they're all listed there. So politics, investigations, policy, health, education, all the rest of them. But you know what? We're still trying to figure out this election. If you want up to the minute updates. I repeat myself. Go to realclearpolitics.com.
We will do that. Well, listen, Jerry Rogers, thank you so very much for joining us today.
God bless you, buddy.
This has been the Lunch Hour with the Federal Newswire. I am Andrew Langer. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.